It's called Askance. The air on the train smelled of cologne and perfume, of cut flowers. Cell phones chimed their hip-hop snippets, and across the aisle a clutch of teenagers chattered in festive voices. It was Saturday afternoon, and people were making plans, continuously honing their plans. Raquel's were simple. She was going to visit her dying mother at Lenox Hill Hospital. The train was traveling south from Yonkers, and soon it eased away from the Hudson and began to cut through the Bronx, paralleling for a time cars speeding along the Major Deegan Expressway. Here, too, she noticed a certain celebratory cant to the cars, to the way the drivers leaned over the steering wheels, as if that might get them into the city more quickly. She, on the other hand, was in no particular rush. Her mother, who'd gone through a number of men before having met the man who'd become Raquel's father, and then she'd gone through him, too, used to sing to herself while doing chores around the house. When you find a man who loves you and he asks you for a dance, don't be too forthcoming. Look askance, look askance. It was a mantra her mother, Anna Lynn, had lived by. If you refused to fully engage with the man who loved you, if you did not look him in the eye and throw caution to the wind, life would ultimately let you down far less often. For you would not be drawn into the tornado of love, her mother's quotes, and so would not be part of the wreckage it tended to leave behind. Birth, childbirth, death, this was a simple path her mother advocated adhering to. Not that there was much choice on either end of it, but it was the way one should think about things, a great expanse with profound points of inflection. These were the children you bore. And everything else people said about life was just higgly-piggly. You make life as you move through life, planting your biological stakes wherever you can. Furthermore, women should be as assertive as men about passing on their genes, about generating new lineages. Don't be chintzy with the womb, her mother would say to her, wagging her finger. Which is why Raquel had 6 half-siblings, the progeny of her mother and 4 men not her own father. And because of this, the world was a diverse place with half-brothers and sisters, half-cousins, half-pets, sprinkled around the northeastern United States. Not to mention the agnate half-sister, Janice, whose mother had married Raquel's father after Anna Lynn was done with him. All of this amounted to a chaotic bounty that Raquel, now 33 and living with her boyfriend, had little interest in replicating in her own life. Instead, she liked the idea of a serene and even-numbered nuclear family. 2 kids from the seed of one man, a man who would stick with her to the very end. And yet, she had doubts, big doubts, that she would be able to pull off such a scheme. That her mother's entire romantic career seemed to pivot on a too serious interpretation of an apocryphal song amused Raquel, though she certainly had an understanding of its darker consequences. The reality, she knew, was that Anna Lynn had simply wrung the subtlety out of the refrain, forced it to match her disposition, made it into a slave metaphor. Even language was beholden to her preconceived notions of romance. Despite all this, Raquel hoped to bring comfort to her mother. She also looked forward to seeing her bevy of halves, who would likewise also be heading toward their mother's deathbed. None, she imagined, quite willing to admit, and she paused to look out over the East River as the train clattered over the Park Avenue Bridge. For she was certainly not admitting anything, was she? That they would find some relief in the matriarch's exit. Soon the train entered the final stretch of its journey, the tunnel at 97th Street. In the depth and darkness, cell phones lost their connection and chattering died down as riders primed themselves for the city. Raquel's boyfriend, Jerry, had stayed behind in the Yonkers condo the two shared. "It's a little late to introduce you to Mom. In any case, it'd be more trouble than it's worth," she'd said. "Maybe be grateful you've been spared." He had walked her the few hundred yards from the building to the train platform, held her elbow as the train approached, then kissed her squarely on the lips as its doors opened. "I'll be back in time for dinner," she said, the April wind whipping her light brown hair into a spray that briefly covered her face. An hour later, though, she would send a text message to Jerry. "I'm too late." It was followed by a teary phone call. "Ma went a half hour ago, before I even had a chance to say goodbye. It's just like her to do that." Her words broke up in little hiccups of grief. "An era ends, don't you think?" She was out on the sidewalk. City traffic roared in the background. "Come home and let me take care of you," he said, but she could barely make out his words. That night, back in the condo, they watched the sunset over the Palisades. Jerry stood behind Raquel and rubbed her back. Her copper-haired Jerry, a man who did this sort of thing all the time, caressed her without rest, sought out her hand when they went food shopping, when they were in the laundry room together. She was sure that one day he'd drive them both into a telephone pole as he searched for her hand instead of watching the road. A man like Jerry would certainly have made her mother run for the hills. But not her, not Raquel. She would compensate for her mother's callousness. She would prove her wrong. Not that she hadn't been tempted to flee. The refrain, after all, in its never-ending loop, was a kind of malignancy. That damn song keeps running through my mind, she found herself saying. Jerry pushed her off and stepped back a few feet. He could always take a hint, he just didn't seem to learn from the experience. She couldn't deal with affection, with love. His voice bordered on the plaintive. Yes, we've talked this to death, Raquel said. She's gone and we're still playing the same tune. If you'd met her, you might see it wasn't so simple. She might have liked you, even. Raquel decided to call her father, Manny, to break the news about his former wife. Last she'd known, he was a research viticulturalist at UCal Davis. She wasn't sure of when he'd last spoken to her mother, but Annalyn hadn't uttered his name in more than a decade. Breaking the news was a matter of courtesy, she felt, and not much more. Manny and Annalyn's divorce when Raquel was 12 had been so contentious that she remembers wondering who would break whose nose first. That no blood was spilled seemed a miracle at the time. Raquel had last seen him in the late 90s. She was living in the East Village at the time, and he'd come down to make peace. As her reward, he'd helped her pay down some of her student loans. My God, he said when told the news. Skip the funeral, Raquel said. She wouldn't want you there. But come to the memorial if you're feeling up to it. It'll probably be in 2 weeks. She had a lot of people in her life. A lot of men, Manny said. Yes, people, too. I'll be there, he said. She was something, your mother, our Annalyn. I don't suppose you've got some room on the floor for an old man to crash? Oh, I didn't bring my beer. Okay. The three of them sat out on the small balcony facing the Hudson River, perched 11 stories up, cantilevered over a narrow band of parking lot, cars diagonally slotted into 2 neat rows. They could see clear across the valley to New Jersey. Oh, thanks, Zach. They could see clear across the valley to New Jersey, and the spring air carried the scent of lilac from the building's gardens below and, from somewhere more distant, diesel exhaust.